Buju, Wago Shindagu, Migizi and Dodame, Minawa, Gaza Gasquaji Makog, and Dunjaba. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Apajini Migwe Chiwaindan, Gaji, Hinenimigwan Bajayan. Kwedash, the wind of Munagug, Mami Quendamong, Yo Awian, Wagosh, Indigu, Minawa, Migizi, and Dodame, Gaza Gasquaji Makog, and Dunjaba. I'm excited to see you all again. I recognize a couple familiar faces from our Tuesday session. I don't know if anyone is joining us new or if everybody's carrying over from the previous session, but I'll give a very brief recap of what we did last time. So I'm speaking, even though there are a number of community members who are joining our conversation, there's this cohort of White Earth students who are working on their AA degree, thinking about going into education. And we spoke a little bit about what it would look like to foster the positive identity development of Native learners. And I profiled a couple of schools like Wadukodading Ojibwe Language Institute, which is the world's first Ojibwe language immersion school. We talked a little bit about how some of this got going in the United States with the Hawaiians and the incredible success that they have had, and really tried to think about what it's like, not just for us trying to navigate these systems, but what it's like for younger learners when they're coming to school, dealing with these very colonial systems. And what I'd like to do today is kind of shift into some other areas. I want to spend some of the time talking about kind of more practical tools and strategies for that work. But I also wanted to spend some of the time speaking about the other big things that we all have to deal with. Trauma, learning and relearning our culture, thinking about the role of culture in our education and the education that we might be delivering for other people down the road. And all of those questions can be sometimes loaded, but so important to deal with. I think all of us have life that happens, and it doesn't take much life to really interrupt, disrupt, or even derail our own educational journeys. And it's like that for every kid at every phase of their own education, which makes it, sometimes scary, but also empowering when we lean in and really help somebody on their journey. And I feel much the same way about the culture journey that so many of our people are on. Through no fault of our own, many of us were denied access to our language, our culture, even connections to our communities. But here we are now, and we can decide what to do with the experiences, both historical through many generations and our own life experiences, to try to make the world a better place. So we'll try to wrangle with some of that during our time together. And like the last time we met, where I spoke for a while but held plenty of time for comments and questions, we'll be doing that again today. So if you have questions, you can think about them. We'll be small enough in number where we can unmute and just talk to each other, but you're welcome to drop things in the chat as we go as well. All right, I'm going to start by sharing a PowerPoint here. See if I can get this working right. I'll assume everybody can see that. Unmute and let me know if you cannot. But what I'm going to do is take just a couple of minutes to provide a little bit better introduction than I did the last time. Last time I did share that, my native name is Wagosh, which means fox. I'm from the Eagle Clan, come from Leech Lake. There it is. My mother is actually enrolled at White Earth and my grandmother, but much of the rest of my family enrolled over at Leech Lake. And, as we were sharing, I also told a little bit about some of my professional work, like I work at Bemidji State University. I teach Ojibwe language, history, and culture there. I mentioned that I do a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, although that wasn't really the primary focus of what we were talking about yesterday. And And also that I just do a lot of community work around our culture and so forth too. These are a couple folks in my own family tree. The gentleman on the left, John Smith, was, I think, also famously photographed. If you haven't seen pictures of him, you probably haven't been living in northern Minnesota that long. But he's a pretty remarkable individual. He was born in the late 1700s and he died in 1922. So he lived in parts of 3 centuries. And he was in our area, you know, when 100% of the land was native land. And he was in our area when natives owned a tiny percentage of their land. Sometimes people outside of reservation communities don't really understand. You look at the White Earth Reservation, it's 40 miles by 40 miles, and natives own 9% of our own reservation. And similarly, you know, at Leech Lake, natives own 4% of our own reservation. So the maps can be a little bit misleading. He never signed any of the treaties, but during his land tenure, natives went from owning all of it to owning this little part of it. And there's so many kinds of historical injustices. By the way, you know, he was in Minnesota before any white settlement, still there when the soldiers came back from World War I. And I just think about the incredible changes he must have seen during his lifetime. And, you know, in spite of it all, it seems strange to me that this is someone, even though he's not even the record holder for human longevity, which is also kind of amazing, but who had a really incredible life that I never got to learn about when I was going to school. And next to him, Wabujig was kind of a famous warrior in the Ojibwe world. These are important and famous people, you know, in our communities and in my family who, again, I never had a chance to learn about. And I think I never had a way to talk about it when I was going to school, but I got more frustrated the older I got that I could go to school for so many years to learn so many important things, and none of it had anything to do with me. It was kind of like those absent narratives were screaming at me. You and yours aren't important, aren't relevant, don't matter. And I reacted like I think like it was the continuation of an age-old assault on our very way of being. And when someone feels assaulted, you get fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses. So a lot of times the professionals are kind of scratching their heads going, how come we have truancy problems with these students over here? And I'm thinking, flight? How come we have discipline problems with these students over here? And I'm thinking, fight. How come these ones are spaced out, zoned out, and hanging out at the Indian Ed office? Or why do so many students want to go, you know, to a tribal college instead of straight into a 4-year program? And to me, we want affinity space and a chance to learn about who we are. By the way, this is a little bit of a sidebar, but it's worth mentioning. This guy right here, he got the name John Smith later in life, which I always find kind of ironic. You know, there is a famous John Smith from all the Pocahontas mythology, but most of what most Americans learn about Pocahontas is complete mythology. There was someone named Pocahontas, and she never fell in love with someone named John Smith. There was someone named John Smith who was in the British Army when they were setting up early colonies. Pocahontas was captured. She was held for ransom. She was forced to marry a different Englishman named John Rolfe, had a son by him, was brought to England, paraded before the Queen, and died by the age of 22. And most of what I just explained, including her capture, ransom, forced marriage to John Rolfe, the birth of her son, all happened while she herself was a minor child. So dressing up that story as romanticism, aside from the historical inaccuracies, is really problematic. We should be disrupting the patriarchy and dismantling things like human trafficking instead of pretending that it was some sort of romantic endeavor. I kind of like this quote by Cornel West. He said, "We are not a nation of immigrants. We are a nation with immigrants, with indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans in our origin. What a difference one little word makes. Instead of we are a nation of, we are a nation with. Because obviously, if you say we are a nation of immigrants, you just said natives aren't part of America. That for many Black Americans for whom their ancestors didn't choose to voluntarily come here, it renders invisible Black pain about the transatlantic slave trade. And that one little word makes a big difference. And I think as Indigenous people, it's helpful for us to just set the right tone and guide and coach other people about how to frame their statements. Oftentimes, when someone says something like we're a nation of immigrants, they're trying to say we're all in it together and aren't aware that they're marginalizing us. So it is good to remind them with an understanding that they haven't been programmed to do so. And you could, by the way, substitute immigrants for any of the other fault lines in our society. It's also the case that we are not a Christian nation. We are a nation with Christians, but also with Jews, with Muslims, with traditional Native Americans, with atheists and agnostics, all of whom are just as American as anybody else. And of course, saying that America is any one thing, it's automatically marginalizing to people who are not that thing. There's so many ways to talk about how Indigenous people have shaped the world that we live in. Sometimes there's this sense, I think, especially amongst non-Native people, that when we talk about Natives, we have to talk about tragedy and trauma and give people trigger warnings. And it's just really important to remind them that we are not only about tragedy and trauma. 87% of the education standards that have to do with Indigenous anything are stories from before 1900, and they are stories with tragedy and trauma. So it both reinforces the kind of trauma porn narrative and also says that we are something that happened in the past. And although it's a little less likely to happen right at White Earth, it's pretty common, especially if you travel the American South or the East Coast, where people think all the natives are gone. I've had people tell me to my face, it's a shame they killed all the Indians. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I'm feeling pretty good today. With the little kids, you can do something like this. This is just a list of some, it's not even a comprehensive list, some of the foods Native people have shared with the rest of the world. And think about corn. It's pretty much in everything we eat, drink, and drive. And that's something Native people shared with the rest of the world. By the way, a plant that was basically bioengineered by Indigenous people. The original corn plant has ears of corn that are that big. And we cultivated, grew, and selected seed in a way that grew that crop into a much larger vegetable. The potato, essential for Russian or Irish cooking, is something that Native people gifted to the rest of the world. And it's kind of ironic, but if you think about Ireland, the potato became so important to the Irish that when there was a blight on the potato there, it sent 2 million people from Ireland to America. How ironic is that? The tomato, imagine Italian food pre-tomato. And you pretty much have to discard the pizza, the lasagna, the spaghetti sauce, and the Mediterranean diet, because that too is something we shared with the rest of the world. The sunflower seed, indigenous to White Earth, here, kind of where the northern plains and, woodlands meet. And then some of my favorites like chocolate, vanilla, and maple. There's so much to talk about. There's more in this book, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask, and many others as well. I think one of the tragedies of the Western educational method is that we have a very narrow range of expectations and evaluations. Like success looks like getting a really good score on your math test, or mastering academic English really well. And the reality is that we are asking people to demonstrate just a very tiny array of intellectual, social, and other aptitudes that are required for somebody to have a healthy, happy life. And I like this quote attributed to Albert Einstein that everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it'll spend its whole life believing that it's stupid. And also, I think it's important to note, colonization, we've all been deeply impacted by it. It's about taking one language, one culture, one religion, and using it to supplant the others. It's about erasure. So no surprise that people steeped in the culture of erasure, one of the greatest fears they have is fear of their own erasure, which is one of the things that makes it so difficult to advance a diversity agenda, in mixed company in this country. And furthermore, if you think about colonization, it is often used violence to do what it purports to do. But when you solve all your problems with violence, you make a bunch of other problems. Now, why would we think that all of the problems created by the colonial way of solving problems can be solved by the colonial way of solving problems? And the answer is they cannot. So one of the things that I believe we should be trying to do, and I spoke to this more when we met on Tuesday, is transform our educational systems so that our kids can learn about themselves as well as the rest of the world, and so that we can do it in a cultural frame that resonates and is effective for everybody, for our kids, and one that will offer a different way of looking at the world and a different way for solving problems. And that is certainly the goal, at least the stated intent for like why we would have a tribal college or why we would have, an indigenous culture-based school at the heart of the White Earth Reservation or things like that. These are some pictures of my father through different chapters of his life. Sometimes it surprises people a little bit because I am brown and braids, and beadwork. Here's my medallion. That my father was not native at all. He was actually an Austrian Jewish immigrant and a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. He spoke only German the first 13 years of his life. He has an amazing story of his own. I won't go into it in too great a depth, but he escaped barely at the age of 13, made it to America at the age of 14. By the time he was 17, he lied about his age, signed up for the US Army. I think he wanted to go kill Nazis, and they stationed him in the Pacific Theater in the Philippines. But eventually, he made his way to Minnesota. He met my mom, and here I am. My mom had a very different journey. She was born in the Cass Lake Indian Hospital on the Leech Lake Reservation. She was raised in the village of Bena. Both of her parents were longtime Bena families, been there for generations since time immemorial. And, I mentioned briefly about this when my mom was growing up, she only met one professional Native American person her entire childhood. And there are like 9,000 enrollees at Leech Lake. They couldn't find one to be a teacher, a social worker, a banker, a police officer, anything. It's so ridiculous, which meant that all of the teachers on the reservation were white. All of the social workers were white. All of the bankers, the police officers, everybody in charge was white. The one professional Native person she met was the school nurse. And she thought, maybe I could do that. So she ended up going to a nursing school, got a nursing degree. One of her first jobs was working for our tribe's health program. And she thought, even here, Native people are getting pushed around. Enough of that. She went back to school and she got a law degree and became the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. So when I was a kid, she'd bring me with her to court. She'd say, you just sit there and don't say anything. So, I'd sit there and not say anything. And I can't remember her court cases, but I remember her being the only woman in court, and her and Paul Day, her law partner, being the only Natives in court. And I'd come walking out of there thinking, you know what? we can do stuff. It was so empowering. We just had that retirement celebration for Paul Day, and it was pretty amazing. I had to tell him, you were the first professional Native man I ever saw. And we were in a room full of Native judges, lawyers, social workers, and educators. It was pretty profound. So we have come a long way, and we certainly have a lot further to go. One of the narratives that we get as Native people is a narrative of poverty. And there's a really good TED Talk. If you want a little follow-up homework, I could recommend. So this TED Talk is by a Nigerian literary figure. Her name is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. If you can't remember that, the title to the TED Talk is very easy to remember. It's called The Danger of a Single Story. The Danger of a Single Story. And in The Danger of a Single Story, among the great things she says is that the problem with stereotypes is not so much that they are incorrect as much as they are incomplete. And they give you one narrow single story to understand the experience of a whole group of people. And no single story is going to tell you everything you need to know about a whole group of people. So, for example, if you wanted to study white people in America, by the way, a lot of people do, but you only looked at poverty in rural white Appalachia and thought, talk about everything handed on a silver platter. Wow. That wouldn't tell you everything you need to know about being white in America. It wouldn't even tell you everything you need to know about being white in Appalachia. Similarly, if you only looked at white people on New York's Upper East Side and thought, talk about everything handed on a silver platter, boy, they got it easy. It also wouldn't tell you everything you need to know. But if you studied white people in America, you don't get a single story, you get many stories. There are stories about white people, even in the movies, who are like good guys. There are stories about white people who are bad guys. There are stories about white people who are good guys breaking bad. There's a whole series about that one. There's stories about white guys who are bad guys turning good. Check out Jaime Lannister in Game of Thrones. So you can even watch a movie like Psycho, and you don't look around and go like, white people, run! Because we know not everybody's the same. If you were to study Native Americans, and a lot of people do, you will see more movies about aliens than natives. And although I do think Hollywood is evolving, we got Reservation Dogs, we have more Indigenous authored content and things that are starting to pop up and percolate. But most of the stuff, even the sympathetic stuff, like a Dances with Wolves type movie, still categorizes like the Pawnee are the bad Indians, the Lakota are the good Indians. And there's still a white guy who's better at being native than the natives, just like Tom Cruise is better at being a samurai than the Japanese. And ultimately, I do feel like Hollywood is evolving, but not fully evolved. So most Americans, when left to their imaginings, imagine us only as poverty, tragedy, trauma, and despair. And that's not everything that there is to know and experience, but it is complex, right? So here's some economic data on Bena, and it's not super pretty. I think a lot of us, if we've been staying in native space, we have seen that there is struggle, hustle, and things like that are going on. At the same time, this is also true. If you look at 1969, 57% of the native population is below the poverty line. When you get up to 2020, you've got 23% below the poverty line. And it tells you two things. So one of the things it does say is that, with 23% of the population below the poverty line, that's gross, that's unacceptable, that's an indictment of America and its oppressions. But it also means we shaved over 30 whole percentage points off of Indigenous poverty, which is the fastest growth rate out of poverty for any group in the country. So if you want to know something about how to disrupt systemic intergenerational poverty, ask Indigenous people. We have the best track record for doing exactly that. And I think when the rest of the world sees those sort of things, it helps move them out of paternalism, and patriarchy and a Jesus complex. Like every time I lean in and talk about diversity, I'm doing those poor people a great favor. Instead, it equips them for a disposition of, I have so much to learn from Native people and about Native people, and might have things that I know too, but it becomes, an exchange and kind of evens out the power dynamics and things like that. So these are important things to communicate about too. I like the Abigail Echo Hawk quote. We are not a historically underserved population. My history is one of ancestors who survived so I could thrive. My history didn't start with Western civilization. I am colonially underserved. I am institutionally underserved, and I am historically resilient. When I was a kid, I got to see some pretty big changes. So, I grew up in part in Bena, and then we moved kind of in between Cass Lake and Bemidji. I ended up going to high school in Bemidji. But when my mom did her law degree, she did it in Washington, D.C. I was pretty young then, as you can see in this picture here, but I did have this experience of like being a Native person and then being the Native person, and it was quite a perspective builder. And so I think that's been helpful for me to try to, imagine, understand the many different kinds of experiences that our people have. In fact, half of our enrolled tribal citizenry lives off reservation. 70% of the self-identified Native population lives off reservation. Our experiences are diverse, internally diverse, and our cultural experiences are also quite diverse across Ojibwe country. And we talked about that a little bit the last time that we met too. When I was very young, my my parents had humble beginnings. My dad was restarting his life. My mom was trying to find, a pathway out of poverty. For a time, we had a house with no electricity or running water. There's me washing up in the creek. They hand me bar soaps. They go out there. We'd buy a gallon of milk, tie a string on it, and sink it in the creek. And it was spring fed, kept it cool. In the morning, he would like pull on the string, pop the top, pour it on your Cheerios, and away you go. And I never felt, disadvantaged. I always had enough to eat. I was well loved. I had a couple parents, like everything was really pretty great. But about the time I hit middle school, my mom had her law degree, built a nice house. The economic profile for our family changed. I kind of like this picture of my mom because she's like got her suit on. She's just, starting off as a lawyer, but she still has her IHS Coke bottle eyeglasses on. It's pretty cute. I could share more about some of my educational experiences. And maybe I'll skip the longer story here, but ultimately, I never had a teacher who was Indigenous throughout K-12, college, master's, up to my PhD. And that had an effect on me. I maybe share one story about when my mom went out to Washington, D.C., and I did first grade out there. And I was the only brown kid in my class. Everyone else was either white or black. And I was a boy and I had long hair. And one day my teacher decided that my hair was pretty and my eyes were cute and decided to dress me up like a girl in front of class, like put barrettes in my hair and some makeup. And they all had a good laugh. And I come from a long line of ferocious warriors. There's no way I was going to complain about that. But I went home and I told my mom, I want a haircut. And she really gave me a look. And then she said, okay. And I ended up getting my hair cut. Didn't grow it out again until college. I never told her what happened, and I never told her why. I think she might have suspected something, but she never prodded. And I toughed it out through first grade. Second grade, I had a black teacher, and it was the only teacher of color I ever had in my whole educational experience. She treated me like a normal human being. It was such a relief. She was left-handed, so I tried to write lefty, even though I'm right-handed. And then third grade, and from then on, always white teachers. And I kind of froze like a deer in the headlights. And I thought, oh God, here it comes again. And so for a skinny native kid, I put on the best stoic Indian you could imagine. They say, what is your name? It says on this paper, your name is Anton. What's your name? And I just go like this. They'd say, oh, why don't you go to the office and talk to the principal? And they'd say, what's your name? And I refused to speak. I kept it up for weeks. It was actually kind of an impressive feat of stubbornness. And they had me assessed with like learning disabilities, behavior disabilities. Makes you wonder about the assessments because I was just scared of white teachers and didn't want to talk. Eventually, they said, we're going to have to expel you and send you to a special school. And, do they speak other languages at home? So finally, I spoke because I could imagine what my mom might do to me. And I said, Dad speaks German, Mom speaks Ojibwe. They're like, oh, maybe that's the problem. So I called my parents into what, in hindsight, was a pretty hilarious conversation with the school administrators. It started with the administrators like speaking very loudly and very slowly, like, hello, we need to speak to you about your son, as if a language problem would be a volume problem. And my mom was like super educated. So I don't know what she said to them. It was something snarky and snippy, like, I'm sorry, sir. Could you distill the salient parts of your communication? That doesn't make any sense to us at all. And then they're saying something like, oh, they speak English. Was that English? I don't know. She also turned around and gave me the native Mother Godzilla laser vision death stare. I started to speak. But that was 3 years of behavior change off of one day. And a lot of us and a lot of our kids have a day. It's not the same as my day, but there's stuff. It could be fellow students saying, hey, Chief, go Redskins. It could be snide comments. It could be hazing, bullying, any number of things. It could be stuff in the curriculum. It could be one-sided narratives. But a lot of our kids have a day. And it doesn't take much to have a really big impact. And one of the things that I think is an important takeaway when we talk about like racism, sexism, things like that, a lot of people understand this information through an individualism filter, like that it has to have a bad person. We say there's sexism, there has to be a sexist who's like trying to keep women down. Or if there's racism, there has to be a KKK person or neo-Nazi or something. And so people get defensive because of this individualism filter. So for example, if we say there's a problem with sexism and patriarchy, then a lot of men are like, wait a minute, I'm a good person. You don't know me. But we're not saying you're not a good person or that you have bad intentions. We're saying that women aren't as safe when they go for a run down the road or on a date, And can we do something about that? We're saying women aren't paid as much money for the same work as men in the workplace. Can we do something about that? It's not about your negative intentions. And so the same thing happens with regard to race too. If we say there's a problem with racism, some people get defensive, like, wait a minute, I'm a good person. You don't know me. But we're not saying that you have malicious intentions. We're saying black and brown people don't get to live as long. We're saying that we have systems and policies and procedures that negatively impact our lives. Can we do something about those things? So an example like this kid, he's a Navajo kid, first grade, in the foster care system going to school in Texas. And the public school system actually had a requirement that all boys have a haircut above the collar. And in the Navajo tradition, if keeping your hair long is an important part of identity, but also culture and spirituality. And they typically would only cut hair if there was a death in the family. And so the foster parents wrote to the school and they said, hey, this is an important part of his culture. This kid just got, yanked out of the house where he was with his parents. If his hair is cut, he might think his parents died. This could be trauma for him. Can we do something different? And the school's response is, well, if you can prove that he's an enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe and authenticate that this is an important part of his religion, we can use that to petition the school board for a variance, which they did. But it makes you wonder what kind of days he might have throughout the system. I raise this not to say like shame on Texas, although maybe there's a whole separate Texas conversation to have. But I bet in Texas they didn't pick their hair policy to be mean to natives. They probably thought short hair on boys is normal. It's hot. We don't have enough air conditioners. We had problems with bullying. And if everyone has the same kind of haircut, then there'll be less issues for bullying. They probably had something like that on their minds, but it still had a racially predictable impact. And a lot of things do. So something like racism or sexism, it operates at a micro level. Those are individual acts, right? Somebody says or does something sexist or racist. But there's also this meso level, which is systems, policies, procedures, patterns, things like the hair policy in Texas. And then in addition to that, there is also something at this macro level. It's like smog. We're all breathing it. And, just as a sidebar example, like my wife and I, we go out to eat. And I would say about 85% of the time, they give me the bill. And about 15% of the time, it goes in the middle of the table. And it may not seem like a privilege to get the bill, but it comes with these assumptions about like, who do you need to impress for a tip? We have these sexist sayings in America, like who wears the pants in the house and that kind of thing. And so it's kind of like a, sexist laden response at a very subtle level. It's never enough to stop us from going out to eat. And by the way, the majority of our servers when we go out to eat happen to be women. And so everybody breathes the sexism smog, everybody breathes the racism smog. So even when we as Indigenous people have a sensitivity about wanting to, champion our children and protect them and engineer systems that do not do them harm, as much as we'd like to think that the work is all about getting the rest of the world to see it and wake up, that's only part of the work. We also have to continually examine ourselves. When is there something that we don't see? When is us breathing the smog going to impact things? Because sexism shows up among all gender groups. Racism shows up among all gender groups. Anti-Black shows up in all groups, including Black. Anti-Indigenous shows up in all groups, including Indigenous. And we can be very hard on ourselves and on our own people. There's my crew. This picture is a few years old now, so we have 9 children. It's a big, beautiful, blended family. We're starting in the grandbaby business now too, so I'll update these pictures here sometime soon. I wanted to share about a couple culture things that intersect with our education experience. This is a picture of one of my sons. His English name is Isaac, Ojibwe name Bejik Obenes. I think in a former time, this kid was simply one of the most promising young warriors in the village. He has an uncanny knack in the woods for hunting. He could set rabbit snares when there's no snow on the ground, which is actually pretty tricky to be able to tell and intuit where the rabbits are going to go and set your snare at the right height and things like that. As a deer hunter, he's a very accomplished deer hunter. And, he would seem to know when to move and when to stand still. He would also keep his cool in the woods. Like a deer would come out and most people would be like, oh, look at that big buck and start shooting. And he would just sit there and wait. You kind of watch that deer moving. And then when the deer's head came behind a tree, then he'd raise up and just wait for it to step out and then shoot and usually drop his deer right there. And if the deer ran, he would take his blaze orange hat and put it on a tree branch so he'd note where he shot from and go until he found a blood trail. And yeah, he says just cool in the woods. We have a ceremony when somebody becomes a successful hunter for the first time. So in Ojibwe, we call this ceremony Oshki Nitagewin, first kill. And in former times, you know, we all lived in wigwam villages, and the custom was to cook up the whole deer and invite the whole village, and it would be eaten in one fell swoop. Now we live like everybody else. We got people going to school, going to work, moving. And so what we will do is we will cook up some of the deer, and instead of just our family, we invite over extended family, aunts, uncles, grandmas, friends of the family, namesakes for the children. And since we have a lot of children, it gets to be quite a few people. And then there's a, you know, a prayer, a blessing of the food. But instead of just eating, we then take a spoonful of the cooked deer meat and we offer it to the successful hunter and say his native name, Bejagobenes. But he has to refuse the first bite and say no. I am thinking about children who don't have enough to eat. Ah, okay. Put it back, get another spoonful, Bejagobenes. And he refuses again and says no. I'm thinking about my elders who can't get out in the woods to hunt for themselves. Ah, okay, put it back, get another spoonful, Bejagobenes. And he refuses a third time. No, I'm thinking about my family, my community, the people who came here today to support me. Ah, okay. And then again, Bejagobenes. And then he can eat. And then we will say, Bejagobenes, you just changed your life. Because up until today, you are what we call a dependent, meaning you depended on all of the people in this room to provide all of your food. But today, you are providing for all of us. And this is what it means to be an adult. From today on, you will have a special power, and it is the power to gather resources. You'll have this when you go hunting, when you go fishing. You'll have it when you get a job. So use your power and think about children who don't have enough. Think about elders who can't get it for themselves, your family and your community. And then he takes the rest of his killed, packaged up venison, gives it away, so he's impoverished, but rich. We also invite all the other successful hunters to speak. One of his namesakes at the first kill feast said, you'll notice that there are different kinds of deer in the woods. Fawns, does, immature bucks with just a spike or a fork horn, and big mature antlered bucks. And deer are very gentle creatures. They rarely would harm a human, but on the rare instances when they would, it sometimes surprises people to know that the deer most likely to charge a human is not a big mature antlered buck, but actually is an immature buck with just a spike or a fork horn. That is the deer also that is most likely to get shot. And what he was doing is kind of providing a little metaphor for manhood, and he further explained. As men, we make many of our biggest mistakes when we're young. That is when we are most likely to think driving 90 miles an hour was a good idea and hurt ourselves or somebody else. It is when we are most likely to experiment with alcohol or drugs and pay a heavy price. It is when we're most likely to go on a date and not respect our partner. So if you want to be a big, mature, antlered buck, you need to act like one. They move a little bit slower. They think before they act. And he went on to explain about what it means to be a man. And it was so powerful. So this kid took this stuff to heart. Like, he would get a rabbit, he'd call up my mom. Noko, Noko, Wabu's in Dayawa. She's like, ooh, Nojishe, I'm cooking for you tonight. And he'd bring his rabbit over there and she'd cook and they'd have dinner together. And I'm thinking, this is cool. Here goes the intergenerational transmission of language, culture, and learning. You know, and I didn't have to tell him, go bring a rabbit to your grandma. And flash forward till he was about 16. And one time I had a friend who was complaining. He's like, oh, my back. I can't remember the last time I had some venison. And he didn't say anything. He went out in the woods. He harvested a deer, brought it home. He, cleaned it up, packaged it up, brought it over to my friend's house, filled up his freezer, and then he left. My friend called me and he was like, I didn't even know people remember that teaching. What an incredible young man. Can I give him some gifts? I said, sure. Flash forward a couple more years, and it was time to go to like senior prom. And so he and his buddy were going to double date to the prom, and I got him hooked up with a tux. And his friend's mom said, my next check, I'll get you the tux, I promise. And then her car went down. So she had to tell her kid, like, I'm so sorry, but I can't. And so he's all broken, ready to like cancel his prom date. My son says, forget that, come on. And so they went to the tux place. My son canceled his tux. He took the money. They went to the Goodwill. They bought a couple of suits. Everybody went to the prom. I show up at prom to like take some pictures of my kid for the promenade. And I'm like, what happened to that tux I rented for you? Then I got the story. And then I had to tell him, like, son, if you would have said something, I would have rented that kid a tux. And he just looked at me like, but Dad, it is my job to look out for people who don't have enough. And one of the things I came to understand is that what is in our cultural toolbox, it reflects our values as a people, and it also shapes our values as a people. And that's pretty cool. It is in the doing of our culture that we internalize it, and it shapes the way we think and function and operate in the world. So instead of professing it or talking about it, just doing the things ends up delivering the goods. Now, I have to tell you, this very same kid, he could sit still in a deer stand for 5 hours in a row. He could not sit still in a desk for 5 minutes. And oh man, it'd be like I saved his discipline reports from school because some of them were just unbelievable. I even saved them from the early childhood program. He went to the Leech Lake Tikanagan. And like one of them, when he was 3 years old, said, today, your son said some derivation of the word butt 300 times. Butt talks, butt crack, help. I was like, oh, save pile. When this kid gets married, I'm reading as many of these as I can. And, another one said, today your son said a foul word in the early childhood classroom. And I told him, we have to tell your father, to which he replied, you better not, I'll kick your ass. I'm a Power Ranger. What do I do with that? Save pile. But by the time he got older, it became more of an issue. Like they'd be sending him home with, tests. They're sending the letters for weeks, like make sure your kid's on time, make sure your kid's well fed, well rested. He gets his test and he's like, finished, I am finished. Are you finished? Woo! And the teacher's like, woo, to the principal's office, IEP, individual education plan. Let's talk about SPED. And so we're sitting there for the individual education plan. And they had this box of tools. I don't know, for those of you who have kids in school, some of you may have had these experiences or seen these things, but it looked like this. First of all, you have a very strong-spirited young man here. And I thought, crap, what did he do now? And then they said, and we want to catch him being good. So sticker charts, we'll give him a gold sticker every time he does, something good. And then when he gets enough gold stickers, he can get a treat out of the treat jar. And here's a permission slip. Can we give your kid gum? And then, we can do card flips. We'll start at green. We drop through all the colors of the rainbow, but he can climb back up. And we want to keep him in this color range as much as we can. And he can hold a ball. He can sit on a ball while he holds the ball. And like they're going through all their stuff. And I was like, I love you guys. I feel your pain, but it's not going to work. It's not going to work because he is from a totally different culture. The toolbox that they had is from Western culture. And I think most of us would agree that there's some pretty obvious things in Western culture. It's really competitive. How many board games or sporting events where nobody wins and nobody loses? Yoga? They'll probably have a yoga competition soon, you know? And also very materialistic, right? I mean, if you got a lot of money, you're a great success. You could have the most horrible character in the world, and you're still a great success if you got a lot of money. It's messed up. In addition to that, we emphasize individualism. Distinguish yourselves from others. What is your last name, your degrees, your credentials, your accomplishments? Me, my. And that's what their toolbox was. Distinguish yourself from others by getting more gold stickers and better card flips, you know? Get treats from the treat jar, rewards, punishments. And I said, this kid is unmotivated by punishments or rewards, but he is highly motivated by relationships. And if we can speak to him in his cultural language, we can get him somewhere. Now, to the credit of the school officials, they said, okay, what would that look like? And I said, well, I don't promise to have all the answers or that there will never be any bumps in the road, but he believes in relationships. He relates to content through story. He loves to share what he knows. He wants the whole world to know that he is a Anishinaabe. And if we let him speak to those things and center those things in his experience, he will engage. So we started sending him to the lower grades to tell stories and different things like that. And yes, there were bumps in the road, but he finished high school unmedicated, full of swagger, and he is off to healthy adulting now because we tried to find ways to speak to him in his cultural language. All too often, we take kids of every shape, size, and disposition, and it's like pound all the different shapes of pegs into the square hole, you know? And that is not a service to the kids. School shouldn't be telling kids what to think and how to behave. It should be teaching kids how to think, and everything will flow from there. So I learned a lot watching my kids. We spoke a lot the last time about positive identity development. And maybe I'll share one more story and then we'll kind of open this up to some questions as we think about this educational space. I guess I should mention briefly too, I don't know, you know, how much formal training you all have done on things like, you know, contemporary trauma, historical trauma, things like that. So maybe I'll just boil this down to a very short piece for that, so I don't take too much time on it. But I think it's critical understanding, like everybody on planet Earth has trauma somewhere in their family tree. When you go far enough back in time, everybody was plunking somebody over the head with a club even. And so we all have it. But I don't think these things, which impact all of us, are always deeply understood. I'll start briefly with just lived trauma. If somebody, like, if I use this model, for example, if you think of the thumb here as like our lizard brain, fight, flight, freeze. Wrapped around it is our wise owl prefrontal cortex. That's the one that says I really should study for my final exam so that I can get a decent grade because it's just one step closer for my educational goals. And we all have all of these things. But when someone experiences stress or a trauma, this goes offline. And it's designed to do so to save our lives. Like, you know, a deer jumps in front of the car, this goes offline, slam on the brakes, and it saves our lives. If there's any kind of threat, we're like either going to go, whoa, run, you know, or I'm going to fight my way through this one, you know, and it saves us. So we need that reaction. And a little bit of stress is actually good for us. That's the kind that says, the alarm went off, I'm getting out of bed, I'm going to get about my day. A little more prolonged stress is tolerable. That's the kind that says, you know what, I'm going to grind this out, finish my AA degree at White Earth, and I'm going to see what's next, heading for my 4-year. And then there's also an intolerable level of stress or trauma, which causes great harm. And especially among children where, they're too small to effectively fight out of the trauma. Too small to run away from the trauma, someone will bring them back. And when that happens, people start to disassociate. They have out-of-body experiences, and it becomes very difficult. And all it takes, if someone has 5 adverse childhood experiences, it starts to rewire our brains. And as a result, we get hyper arousal, which is like angry, agitated, emotionally reactive, or we get hypoarousal, spaced out, zoned out, disengaged. Examples of each would be, hey, Johnny, come on in. It's time to do our test today. And he goes, what you coming at me like that for? Throws the chair, Or, hey, Johnny, come on in. It's test time today. Huh? And sometimes the same person may ping pong between both behaviors, emotionally reactive, out of touch, back and forth. And so that can happen when somebody has had trauma experiences. What we've been learning, and you may have heard this discussed in different terms, historical trauma, or epigenetics, the epigenetic imprint of trauma, that it doesn't even have to be our trauma. It could be the trauma of a parent or a grandparent. And some of those trauma things get passed forward through generations. So this stuff has been studied in rats, for example, by taking a rat, and the poor rats, like the stuff they have to go through. They put a electrode into the pain center of the rat's brain, give it a pain stimulus, and introduce the smell of apple blossoms, and that rat will be terrified of the smell of apple blossoms for the rest of its life. However, the children of that rat with no pain stimulus will also be scared of the smell of apple blossoms, and the grandchildren of that rat will also be scared of the smell of apple blossoms. It's not genetic, because if it was genetic, all rats would always be scared of apple blossoms. It is epigenetic, meaning it comes from an environmental stimulus, but it still gets passed forward through generations. And so it's hard to properly study in humans because you cannot ethically subject humans to trauma. So most of the studies have been studies of twins separated at birth, raised in different environments. It's imperfect, but we're getting much more information about it. If you're interested in this topic, I'm happy to recommend books like It Didn't Start With You, or or some of the, Gabor Mate work on the effects of trauma, and I think he does some really great work. But in any event, we do know that this impacts us, and it's raising more questions that we still need to explore. Like, we're finding people who have very specific triggers, like in It Didn't Start With You, there was this person who would be triggered in a very specific situation or even at a very specific date, even though they never had trauma associated with that situation or that date, but their biological grandmother had, even though they'd been separated from their birth family and knew nothing about their stories. So when you think about our people in the 1800s being chased around by soldiers on horses with blue uniforms and guns, that there was a trauma experience there. And today we police them with people wearing blue uniforms, carrying guns. And then we wonder, why is somebody so agitated during a routine traffic stop when there's all this other possibility that we don't fully understand? And by the way, the person who feels agitated when they see a blue uniform may not know what might be causing the agitation. And it could be any number of things, because humans are complex, but we are seeing that this epigenetic imprint is really significant. By the way, my dad was a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust. My grandmother went to residential boarding school. My mother experienced abuse, and I am doing okay. We are not beholden to our trauma experiences, but they do affect us. I sometimes become emotionally reactive or agitated. I also numb out and like just scroll TikTok, when I should be doing something else. I see myself going to both coping mechanisms. But as I understand how these things work and understand myself better, I am better able to cope. And one of the things Gabor Mate said that I thought was really profound is he said, when people have experienced trauma or have the epigenetic imprint of trauma from something that happened to their parents or grandparents, that we are desperately seeking safety. And this is why there's like this pull towards addictions or different things like that. It's a way to feel safer even for a minute, even if objectively you're not as safe when you're abusing drugs or something. But that he said, even though people are desperately seeking safety and making unsafe decisions to try to feel safer, that safety itself is not the absence of threat. It is the presence of connection. Safety is not the absence of threat, it is the presence of connection. So, when we are trying to be effective, either helping ourselves get through this modern higher ed system or helping young people become educated, tuning into and paying attention to that is critical for our own successes and helping other kids through these systems. And how do we engineer safety? The feeling of safety is through the connection with the instructor, and especially connection with our culture and our language. And those things provide a web of positive neurotransmission, healthy relationship building, understanding, and so forth. And why I devote my life to our language and culture, because these things provide the highest level of healing, connection, safety, and a pathway to vibrancy. So the final little story I'd like to share with you is, this is another one of my sons. His name is Elias Bogwajanini, wild man. And he, oh man, the number one job as a parent is do not mess your kids up. And it's such a terrifying job because you got one shot at it and you don't get any do-overs. So I mentioned before that I have a big, beautiful blended family. And what I didn't mention is that my ex-wife had a terrible stumble into the darkness, the kind that everyone's aware of and that actually affects all of us. She got into drugs. She, against all odds, she is still alive, but she's been actively using for well over 20 years. We have tried everything to help her, to get her to treatment, to intervene. I live in a beautiful house and I'm surrounded by kids and grandkids. She is literally unhoused. She's on the street and still actively using. And there's nothing we can do. It's so heartbreaking. This kid was an infant in arms when she fell. And as a result, he is the recipient of the kind of blessings and curses only a father can bestow. He has no memory of being held by his mom. And I had to restart with this kid and all the others. I really relied on our culture here too. We had a ceremony to bless our new house. And there are different ways people do this. Some people build a mini teepee in the backyard, some a miniature wigwam. We actually blessed a miniature or a small eagle feather and hung it on the southwest corner of the house. And we still do that, but we also have a cedar pole outside where we make offerings now. There's different good ways to do that. Some people use cedar and tobacco ties over doors and windows. But in any event, we did that, and it seemed to reassure him a lot. Like I said, this will keep us safe even when there's a big thunderstorm or something. Sometimes it would start storming, he'd run outside do a lap around the house. And I was like, what are you doing? He's like, checking on the feather. And but it seemed to help. We have another ceremony, is pretty great. It's called a bear smoke, where we build a miniature wigwam, and then we put little offerings in there for each member of the family, and it's a way to kind of hold us together under one roof. And same thing, he'd be out playing around in the woods, but he'd run up to that and he'd look at it and he'd smile, and things would, he'd be back to playing or whatever. I say, like, here too, I was overwhelmed, up to 7 children, single parenting at one point. And I'd bring the kids out to eat, and I'd say, let's go to a buffet and put us in the far back, as far away from normal humans as possible, because my kids could be a handful. A couple times people burst into applause when we left a restaurant, just to give you an idea. And they would, like, from the back, my kids would go up to the front, use the restroom, and then run through the restaurant going, I took a crap. And I was like, I don't know them. And I remember one time, this kid, he was, it's time to put his coat on at the buffet, and he couldn't get his fists through the coat. And I was like, okay, baby, what's in your hands? He's like, I got the mac and cheese. And he's like trying to smuggle 2 cents worth of mac out of the buffet. So part of me is thinking, like, oh my God, how resi can you be? And it's funny. And then part of me is also feeling worried, like, does this mean he's going to have issues? Like, his mom can be taken, so anything can be taken, and he's going to be hoarding food and sticking it between the mattresses in his room, And I think I always worried, like, would he deny himself opportunity for the sake of familiarity? Or would he run away from everyone and everything so he could feel safe not being around native anything? Would he, self-sabotage and soothe himself with unhealthy behaviors? And so it turned out okay. Like, he got into music. We have a program they call it's kind of show choir. It's kind of like Glee Club. I had to watch every episode of that show Glee with the kids too, and I was teasing him. And I said, this is going to be just like that show. Like, whoever's dating at the start of the school year, they're all going to switch by the end of the school year. And there's going to be a lot of crying and a lot of good singing, and then there's going to be a big fat trophy at the end of the year. Everyone's going to be hugging each other. It'll be awesome. And he said, shut up, Dad. It's not going to be like that. You don't know. I was like, okay, we'll see. And then I had to miss his first out of town meet. So I said, it doesn't matter what time it is, midnight, 1 a.m., you call me. So I got this phone call, which I wish I could have recorded because it was pretty awesome. It started with, Dad, I love you. And I got like a dozen spontaneous I love yous out of a teenage son, which is totally great. Anyways, it's like, I love you. Everybody's crying. They're all hugging each other. We won. And I was like, I told you. And so things are going great. And then, like, the pandemic hit, show choir is canceled, prom is canceled, friends are canceled, blah. And he was sulky and sullen, and it was a tough time. And I think all kids, have to break from their parents. It's healthy that they break from their parents and that they have a phase where parents don't know anything and stuff like that. And it seemed like the girls would usually like have it out with my wife, and they would tend to mature a little bit earlier than the boys. And the boys would tend to have it out with me, usually maturing a little later, like age 17. But that's also when it's time to come up with a launch plan and think about what's next. And it's a terrible time for a dad to kind of lose temporary influence with his kid. So I had to push him, and I said, look, my boy, there are 1,000 definitions of success. One of your brothers decided to go into construction. He's working on his journeyman's on a union construction crew. Some of your other siblings decided to go to college. You don't have to pick any idea that I come up with, but you just got to pick something. My job is to support you. If you're willing, I'm happy to help coach, but that part will be up to you. So finally he said, okay, college. I was thinking about going to Dartmouth. Of all those Ivy League schools, that's the one that has some decent native programs. part of me is thinking like 7% of the people who apply to Dartmouth get in. But my job is not to close doors. My job is to support. So I said, that is a wonderful goal. I'm happy to support you. And he had to write essays, which ended up being a very powerful experience. He wrote about our family. He wrote about my dad, who he was quite close to. He wrote about my grandma, who went through residential boarding school. He wrote about his mom, times when he was mad, times when he was sad, times when he couldn't feel anything at all, except maybe guilty because he couldn't feel anything. And then he said some really profound things. He said, all that trauma, it stops with me. We are more than the sum of our tragedies. Out of the mouth of babes. Pretty incredible. It took a little while, and I'll see if I can get this to work. And then we got this. Let's go! Oh, I'm so happy for you. Oh, my boy. Oh, I miss you. Come here, Evan. You know, that was about a lot more than getting into the college of his dreams. I think he found a way to make it in spite of all the adversity and all the things. And people had said things to me over the years which never quite resonated, like you saved those kids, you pulled them out of the darkness and things like that. And it never felt quite right. That in many ways it was very much the other way around. Every time he was running around the house to check on that eagle feather, or looking at the bear smoke, or finding a way to sing through adversity, he was restoring my faith in the decency of humans, in our ability to overcome even the toughest obstacles. I didn't save him, but he saved me. And I really, again, believe that our culture was the key to making that happen. All right. My mom had a pretty good line. She said, nothing can stop a native who knows who they are. She used to get a lot of questions just about me and my siblings. My sister's got a law degree. I got a brother who's a medical doctor, got another brother with a PhD, and she's straight out of Bena, and everybody knows someone who burned up in a house, you know. And they'd ask her, how'd you do that? And she says, I don't know. I just know that I believe in education, but not just from books. I made sure my kids had exposure to their language, their culture, and that makes all the difference, because nothing can stop a native who knows who they are. I like this Margaret Mead quote, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. I'm really proud of you, the students at White Earth, who are going through this program, who are considering, you know, not just furthering your own education, but how you can apply it to the betterment of your community, because that's what you're doing. You are the thoughtful, committed citizens who can make everything different. And I do believe in the work, and I also believe in you to do the work. I like this Lila Watson quote too, where she says, she's an Australian Indigenous person. She said, if you've come to help me, you're you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is tied up with mine, then let us work together, which I think is a really healthy frame for approaching all of this. This is the view off the front deck of our house. I kind of feel like Shrek. That's my swamp. Among the things that happened when my folks were getting started, they had acquired this property. And if you look away from the water up the hill, it didn't look like this at all. It looked like this, wide open farm fields. Looked like over by the Menomin side of the reservation. And it's my dad on the tractor with one of my brothers there. They started planting trees, and they planted all of the trees in this picture here and it completely transformed the entire landscape and the ecosystem. It's just a couple of people. Of course, they had a child labor force, but what a change. And I think a lot of us look around at the world, at climate change, politics, race relations, all the problems we have. And it's so easy to think, like, there's not much I can do. I'll try to be decent human. I'll tell my kids to be decent humans, and I hope it's enough. And it never feels like enough, because all that's necessary for evil to triumph is good people to do nothing or too little. But it's not like we need to take this mountain of problems humans have been making for thousands of years and move that whole mountain right now. It's more like we need to keep planting the seeds, and it can change everything. That's what we do. That's what we do when we come to receive an education, when we try to give one to other people. It is noble, important, beautiful work. And with that, I want to say miigwech for listening. I'm going to drop the PowerPoint and we'll open it up for some questions and answers. Miigwech. All right. So I want to thank you all for tuning in, and also for receiving stories today that were a little more personal, not just professional. I think it takes some emotional generosity to receive one another's stories. So I do want to thank you for that. As I open it up for questions and comments, anything you want to ask and anything you want to share is very welcome. Whether it's about how your own journeys in education, the systems we're trying to shape and change, or any of that, you're more than welcome. Hey there, Carrie, were you gearing up for a question there? Okay, no problem, and no pressure. Yeah, Bridget dropped the name Gabor Mate. He's got several books out.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite authors and speakers and on trauma, and that epigenetics is something that's very interesting to me. So you said you would share some of his work or some of your favorite works of his.
Yeah, so I recently read, forget the precise wording on the title. It's got Hungry Ghosts in the title. It's like Hunting for Hungry Ghosts, which is mainly about trauma. He also has some, trauma and addiction. He has some other ones about trauma and its connection to ADHD. Also, if you just looked up his name in YouTube, he does a lot of public speaking and interviews. And so you can catch shorts and snippets, in very digestible amounts that speak very powerfully to these topics. So pretty easy to find.
Yeah. I think he has a documentary coming out, or that came out also, called Trauma. So and it's
Mm-hmm.
very relevant. I
Yep.
think his family is Holocaust survivors too. So
Right. Right.
I have a question for our students. Well, for you before our students, what kind of what's a some tips and like a message to some of our Head Start Pathways program students that are, going through their educational journey themselves, and are trying to kind of give back to their community as they themselves are learning the language, and the teachings and the songs and the ceremonies as well.
Oh, yeah. So first of all, almost every path a person could pick in their life will have certain challenges, certain things that are tough about it, and certain things that are easier about it. But there's no way to just have easy. So that has been helpful to me just to remember and realize that, like, every choice is going to have a crap sandwich that comes with it. By the way, that goes with like every relationship you're in, with every one of your siblings, your parents, and your cousins, with everyone you would ever date. There's no way to get to perfection. And frankly, even if you found perfection, you and your partner would change, shift, and grow. And if you have a long relationship with someone, you don't end up with one relationship with one person. You end up with many different relationships with the same person over a longer period of time. And so understanding that, You just put a pickle on top of that sandwich and proceed. You know, that has been helpful to me because sometimes I thought, oh, this must not be the right place or the right decision or the right way because it feels hard. Everything feels hard. Also, there are blessings and supports all along the way too. I think as you proceed, it's also good practice to not just work hard and study hard, but take care of yourself. Like, you know, get enough sleep. Your brain will function at twice the capacity if you're getting 8 hours of sleep a night as it will if you're getting 5. You're not going to actually be more productive shaving time off of something that critical. Eat and eat good food. We are in a food desert. There's a lot of crap food out there. Eat something healthy. Your body will love you for that. Drink a lot of water. You know, I find that like sometimes navigating the systems, honestly, even a tribal college has these issues too, where like feels like we're swimming in the whiteness. And so, you know, it can just grind you out. It's exhausting. So I find that I like need to like peace out and spend some time in, you know, either by myself, and everyone's wired a little differently. I'm a outgoing introvert, so my battery gets charged away from humans. But once I'm charged, then I love humans and I'm not super shy, but you know, but other people are wired differently. They need the, you know, human connection to charge up. However you're wired, get what you need. I find that I need to spend time out of the whiteness in my native space. So I love my ceremony life, drum ceremonies on the weekends as much as I can. We go to medicine dance in the summers and, you know, other things too, powwows, and also just with our whole big, beautiful extended family, you know, that stuff is so critical so that I can kind of charge up and get a break. Like, it's kind of like if you have kids and you always have to take your kids with you in public, it's like this hyper vigilance, making sure they're not destroying things or getting hurt, you know, and so that you can only relax when you're at home. And it's like that just being indigenous, navigating the whiteness. It's like, got to have your suit of armor on and be extra careful and, you know, and so get some time in your own space so you can just not have to lift so much weight all the time. And I think as you tend to your own self-care and your affinity space needs and, you know, all of that, then you have a little more strength and stamina for navigating that stuff too. I do spend some of my time like, you know, talking to the rest of the world and, you know, trying to help them understand us better and doing work in mixed company. I do, you know, I have the blessing at my work too, where I have a lot of Native students and a lot of Native staff. And so I'm kind of, that provides some kinds of affinity space too. But, you know, Natives, a lot of us are still learning how to like deal with one another in a healthy way. And there's more to say about that. So ultimately, I think you got to find out what you need, and it may shift and change. Like sometimes I'll have a long spurt where I'm giving or over giving, and then I need to like take a little longer break and, you know, charge up. And that's all healthy and part of the game. You know, I find with higher ed, there are some like problems to the way it's structured. It's very old school. So like you get a lot of pressure at midterms and final exams time and kind of comes in spurts. So try to find ways to like pace it out. If you got a paper that you know is due at the end of the semester, it's okay to start it a little early and percolate your thoughts. And, you know, it kind of makes it so it's not all coming at you for a cram the night before. And those are some, you know, some tools that can be helpful. I think generally speaking, at the tribal college level, you get a little bit more social support and a little bit more leeway than you will, you know, as you keep moving up the chain. So like, you know, when you get into the 4-year school, they might expect you to be a little more self-starting. They tell you the assignment, they don't remind you a bunch of times. You know, it kind of depends on where you go, how that is, but just adapt to the environment and be ready for what's coming. And there are a lot of different ways to do it now. You know, that I think the technology and other things are kind of shifting up for both better and worse. Good question.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions from, we've got 13 people with, well, 15 total, but anybody else have some thoughts or questions before we've got a few minutes left.
Bonjour, Alana and Dijnakas. Obeshikukan and Dunji. I think them.
Mm-hmm.
I just, I'm from way up north, Laxio, Ontario. So I just wanted to say miigwech for sharing your information. I'm just joining this your or this little meeting just to explore how to revitalize our Ojibwe language. I am a teacher. I went to Brock University. It was like 5-year program, and I only taught maybe 5 years out of that time. So I'm in the Head Start program. So I'm learning my language at the same time with my little ones. So and I just started a language table with my community. So that's where I'm at now. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for sending me a link to listen to you speak. Miigwech.
Oh, miigwech. Miigwech, Alana, really nice comments. This one is a little more geared for like the education students in the program, but I teach our language, and I've got a book called The Language Warriors Manifesto, How to Keep Our Languages Alive No Matter the Odds, which will be on point for exactly what you're talking about. How do I go about it as a learner to get my language? How can we work together to build something for our community to revitalize our language? And what parts of the work, need to happen? How do we strategize that? What is my role in that? So that one will be helpful for you with that. And by the way, I should also mention too, like I know I dropped my my website into the links in the chat there, and I've got lots of free resources on the website. So I got a YouTube channel with lots of talks. I got lists of Indigenous authored books, to connect people to. I've got free resources for teachers where they've combed through the education standards that have to do with Native stuff and what resources they recommend at each grade level, kindergarten, first grade, so forth. And so there's some pretty great stuff there when you start thinking about, even if you have a project like, okay, I need to develop a lesson plan for early childhood about this, just looking at the recommended resources for educators will point you in some directions that'll be useful for students and others who are trying to pull all that stuff together. Thanks for the great comment in the chat there, Sydney. I just saw that. Wonderful. Well, and thanks for all of your work and service around such critical topics. I can see we're bumping up against the clock a little bit too, and you probably need to go eat. Yeah. I just want to, thank you again for that comment, Sydney. Yes, we are more than the sum of our tragedies, for sure. The kid's name is Elias. You can quote him. All right. Appreciate you all. Thanks for all your work and service to the people, for tuning in today and being engaged. Appreciate you all. Stay in touch. Miigwech.
Miigwech. Thank you, everybody.
All right. You too.
Miigwech
for watching today. I'm Anton Troyer.